On the night of September 14th, 1974, 11 men were executed inside a converted tobacco storage building on County Road 49 in Yazoo County, Mississippi. All adults, all shot down over a 6-hour period. The perpetrators, two brothers, James and Robert Carter, who walked into that illegal poker game with enough ammunition to supply a military platoon. The FBI would later classify it as the most systematic rural mass killing in Mississippi history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't narcotics, wasn't a gang conflict, wasn't even organized crime. It was an $8,500 gambling debt, a fraudulent property transfer, and a dying father's humiliation that nobody would answer for. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Yazoo County, Mississippi, sprawled across 934 square miles of Delta flatlands in 1974, home to about 27,000 souls scattered between cotton fields and small towns that time seemed to have forgotten. Silver City, if you could even call it a municipality, sat 12 miles west of Yazoo City proper. Population maybe 400 on a good Sunday when church let out. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where the Piggly Wiggly closed at 6, and where the nearest medical facility was a 43-mile drive down Highway 49. September in the Mississippi Delta meant temperatures still hovering around 82 degrees at sunset. The air thick and wet like breathing through a warm washcloth, the smell of turned earth mixed with distant wood smoke from farmers burning off fields. At night, the darkness came complete. No street lights beyond the main intersection, just the occasional porch light, and the sound of crickets so loud it felt like the earth itself was humming. Mosquitoes the size of houseflies worked in shifts. The Mississippi River ran its ancient course 15 miles to the west, and when the wind came from that direction, you could smell the mud and decay that had been there since before anyone's grandfather was born. But 1974 was a brutal year for rural Mississippi. Watergate had dominated the news. Nixon resigned on August 9th, leaving the whole country feeling like the ground was shifting under their feet. Down in the Delta, though, people had their own problems. Cotton prices had dropped, small farms were getting swallowed by agricultural corporations, and everywhere you looked, men who'd worked their entire lives were watching their land slip away to banks or to men with better lawyers and fewer scruples. In that world, the underground gambling circuit wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of life. Every Saturday night, men gathered in barns, warehouses, back rooms of stores that had gone out of business but hadn't been torn down yet. They played poker, shot craps, bet on anything that could be measured or timed. The Dixie Mafia, that loose confederation of Southern criminals who made the Italian mob look organized, had their fingers in most of it, taking a percentage, providing protection, ensuring the local law looked the other way. Sheriff's deputies, who made $6,800 a year, could be convinced to take a Saturday night off for the right price. In Yazoo County, the biggest game ran in Turner's warehouse on County Road 49. Every Saturday night, stakes high enough to matter, not so high you'd attract federal attention. The kind of game where a man could lose his truck or win enough to make his mortgage payment, where handshakes still meant something, and your word was your bond. At least that's what everyone believed until it wasn't. James Lee Carter turned 34 on June 12, 1974. He stood 6'1", lean in the way men get when they work physical jobs and skip meals, with shoulders that had broadened from years loading hay bales and wrestling farm equipment. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and engine work, knuckles permanently swollen from too many fights in his younger days, a thick scar cut through his left eyebrow. Souvenir from Vietnam, Khe Sanh, February 1968. When a piece of shrapnel had missed his eye by less than an inch, he'd come home with a purple heart, nightmares he never discussed, and a belief that the world made sense if you followed the rules and kept your word. Every morning, James woke at 5:15 a.m. in the small farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1923. He'd make coffee in the same percolator his mother had used, strong enough that you could stand a spoon in it, and sit on the back porch watching dawn break over the soybean fields. He'd smoke 2 cigarettes, Pall Mall straights, and then start his day. Feed the chickens, check the equipment, work whatever job he'd picked up for the week. James was a handyman, a mechanic, a man who could fix damn near anything if you gave him time and the right tools. He'd married young, 19, right before shipping out. But that marriage hadn't survived his return from Southeast Asia. By 1974, he lived alone in the house with his father Samuel, who at 68 was dying slowly from emphysema. Each breath a rattling struggle. Samuel had worked 43 years at the cotton gin, breathed in enough dust to fill a silo, and now spent his days in a chair by the window, an oxygen tank hissing beside him like a mechanical cobra. What James valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much of that. What he valued was respect. The kind of respect that came from keeping your word, paying your debts, standing up when a man needed standing up. His father had taught him that. His grandfather, before that. 3 generations of Carter men who believed that honor wasn't just a word you said. It was how you lived. In the summer of 1974, that honor was being tested. Samuel Carter owned 180 acres of Delta farmland, free and clear, or so everyone thought. Land his father had homesteaded in 1919, land that should have passed to James and his younger brother Robert when Samuel died. But the old man had gotten into some trouble. Medical bills from the emphysema, 3 hospitalizations in 2 years. And somewhere along the way, Samuel had borrowed money, using the land as collateral. James didn't know the details. His father was proud, wouldn't discuss it, but he knew something was wrong. Samuel had stopped sleeping, spent hours staring at papers spread across the kitchen table, muttering to himself in a voice so hoarse you could barely understand the words. Robert Franklin Carter, everyone called him Bobby, was 29 years old that September, 5 years younger than James, but in many ways still the kid brother who'd followed James everywhere since he learned to walk. Bobby stood 5'10", stockier than his brother, with thick forearms from years working as a mechanic at Johnson's garage on Highway 49. He had a round face that made him look younger than his years, a quick smile, and a 3-year-old son named Samuel Jr. Sammy, who was the light of Bobby's life. Bobby had married Rita McKinney in 1970, a small woman with fierce eyes who worked the register at the Piggly Wiggly and kept the family fed on Bobby's mechanic wages. They lived in a rented house 2 miles from the family farm, close enough that Bobby came by every evening after work to check on his father and help James with whatever needed doing. Bobby worshipped his older brother, always had. When James said jump, Bobby asked how high. When James said it was going to rain, Bobby grabbed an umbrella. That kind of loyalty ran deep, the kind forged in childhood and hardened by the shared knowledge that they only had each other. The 2 brothers had one more thing in common. They both played in the Saturday night poker game at Turner's Warehouse. Had been playing there for 2 years. James was good, patient, calculating, able to read men the way some people read books. Bobby was reckless, the kind of player who'd bet his last dollar on a pair of 3s because he had a feeling. Together, they were regulars at the table, known quantities, men who paid their losses and collected their winnings without drama. That's where they met Lester Lucky Haynes. Lucky Haynes was 41 years old, a man who'd never worked an honest day in his life, and wore that fact like a badge of honor. He stood about 5'9", soft around the middle with slicked back hair that he dyed jet black to hide the gray, and a smile that looked like something you'd see on a used car salesman right before he sold you a lemon. Lucky dressed too well for Yazoo County. Polyester suits in shades of brown and tan, wide collar shirts, platform shoes that added 2 inches to his height. He wore a gold ring on every finger and smelled like English leather cologne applied with a heavy hand. Lucky ran the poker game at Turner's warehouse. He didn't own it. The building belonged to Horace Turner, who'd stopped growing tobacco in 1968 and rented the space to whoever could pay. But Lucky organized it, invited the players, handled the money, took his percentage off the top. He had connections to the Dixie Mafia, the kind of connections that meant the game ran smooth, the local law stayed away, and nobody got robbed walking to their car with their winnings. Lucky's word was supposed to be good. His handshake was supposed to mean something. Lucky had a wife, Sharon, 38, and 2 teenage daughters living in a brick ranch house on the nice side of Yazoo City. He drove a 1973 Cadillac Eldorado, pale yellow with a white vinyl top, and he parked it where everyone could see it. Lucky was the kind of man who needed you to know he had money, needed you to see his success, even if that success was built on taking percentages from desperate men betting money they couldn't afford to lose. For 18 months, Lucky Haynes and Samuel Carter had been doing business. James didn't know the full story. Wouldn't know until it was too late. But the outline was simple enough. Samuel needed money for medical bills. Lucky said he could help. He had a friend who made private loans, easy terms, no questions asked. Samuel signed papers. Money changed hands. And somewhere in that transaction, Lucky Haynes had done what Lucky Haynes always did. He'd found an angle, worked a scheme, and made sure he came out ahead. The explosion came on Friday, September 6, 1974, just after 2:00 in the afternoon. James was under the hood of his truck in the driveway, replacing a fuel pump that had finally given up after 140,000 miles of Delta roads when he heard his father's scream. Not a yell, a scream. The kind of sound a man makes when something inside him breaks. James ran into the house, found Samuel standing in the kitchen, clutching a letter, his face the color of old newspaper. The oxygen tank hissed beside him, but Samuel wasn't using it. Wasn't breathing right, his chest heaving like a broken engine trying to start. "They're taking it," Samuel wheezed. "They're taking the land." The letter was from a law office in Jackson. Official letterhead, legal language that James had to read 3 times to understand, but the meaning was clear. Samuel Carter's land, all 180 acres, had been signed over to Lester C. Haynes as payment for a debt of $12,300. The transfer was legal. The deed was recorded. The land was gone. "I didn't," Samuel gasped, sinking into a chair. "I never," he said. "It was just collateral. Said I'd never lose it. Said," the old man couldn't finish, couldn't breathe. James called Bobby, then called for an ambulance. By the time it arrived, Samuel had suffered a heart attack. Not massive, but enough. The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance and disappeared down County Road 49. Lights flashing, siren cutting through the afternoon heat. At the hospital, after the doctor stabilized him, after they'd moved him to a room with machines that beeped and hissed, Samuel told his sons the whole story. How Lucky had approached him 18 months ago. How the loan had seemed simple, $8,500 at 15% interest due in 12 months. How Lucky had explained that the land deed was just a formality, that banks required collateral even though no way would it ever come to that. How Samuel had trusted him because Lucky was a regular at the Saturday game, because men who played poker together looked out for each other, because in Yazoo County your word was supposed to mean something. But Lucky Haynes's word meant nothing. He'd structured the loan so that when Samuel couldn't make the payments, and Samuel couldn't, not with hospital bills eating everything, the land transferred automatically. Legal. Clean. And because Samuel couldn't read legal documents worth a damn, because he'd signed papers he didn't understand, because he'd trusted a man in a polyester suit who smelled like cheap cologne, the Carter family land was gone. James and Bobby sat in the hospital parking lot until after midnight, not talking, just sitting in James' truck with the windows down, listening to crickets and the occasional car passing on Highway 49. Finally, Bobby spoke. "We have to do something." James lit a cigarette, the flame from his Zippo briefly illuminating his face. The scar through his eyebrow looked like a crack in stone. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We do." What Lucky Haynes didn't know, what nobody in Yazoo County knew yet, was that James Lee Carter had spent 13 months in Vietnam learning how to end human lives with mechanical efficiency, that he'd come home with skills the Army had spent considerable time and money teaching him. That he'd buried those skills deep, tried to forget them, tried to be just a mechanic, and a farmer, and a good son. But some things once learned never go away. They just wait. And on September 6th, 1974, in a hospital parking lot that smelled like asphalt and diesel fuel, those skills woke up. The Saturday night poker game at Turner's Warehouse ran every week. Tomorrow was Saturday. Lucky Haynes would be there. So would everyone who sat at that table and watched Lucky smile while he destroyed a family. So would the Carter brothers. The week between Samuel Carter's heart attack and Saturday, September 14th, moved with the strange, slow quality of a dream, where you know something terrible is coming, but can't wake up to stop it. On Sunday, September 8th, 2 days after the hospital, Bobby came by the farmhouse just after noon. James was in the kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the legal papers spread across the table, the same papers that had put his father in the hospital. The deed transfer, the loan documents with Samuel's shaky signature, all of it legal, all of it a lie wrapped in lawyer language. Bobby brought his son Sammy, who was 3 years old and didn't understand why Grandpa Samuel was still in the hospital or why Uncle James looked like he hadn't slept in days. The boy ran into the kitchen, clutching a toy truck, the kind of simple happiness that only exists before the world teaches you different. "Uncle James, look." Sammy held up the red truck, wheels spinning. "It goes fast." James picked up the boy, held him for a moment. Sammy smelled like Johnson's baby shampoo and grape jelly. His small hands patted James's scarred face with complete trust. The kind of trust that believed adults could fix anything, make everything right. "That's a good truck, buddy," James said quietly, then set him down. "Go show your daddy." Bobby stood in the doorway watching. He knew his brother well enough to recognize the look. The same look James had worn in the weeks before he shipped out to Vietnam. The look of a man who'd already made a decision, but hadn't told anyone yet. "We going to do something about this?" Bobby asked, his voice low so Sammy wouldn't hear. James looked at his younger brother. Bobby had his whole life ahead of him. A wife, a son, a job that paid decent. He could walk away from this. Should walk away from this. "Yeah," James said. "We are." Bobby nodded once, didn't ask for details. That was how it had always been between them. James led. Bobby followed, and neither questioned the bond. That was Sunday. By Monday, everything had changed. James made the first move on Monday morning, trying to do things the right way, the legal way, the way men were supposed to handle disputes in a civilized country. He drove to the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office, a brick building on Jefferson Street that smelled like old coffee and cigarette smoke, and asked to speak with Sheriff Tom Beckworth. Beckworth was 56, a thick man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the Delta's ugliness to be surprised by anything anymore. He listened to James's story, the loan, the deed transfer, Lucky Haynes's fraud, with the expression of a man who'd heard similar stories 100 times before. "Son," Beckworth said, leaning back in his chair until it creaked, "I understand your frustration, but if the papers are legal, if your daddy signed them, he was tricked," James said, keeping his voice level. "Lucky Haynes lied to him, told him the land was just collateral, that he'd never lose it. Can you prove that? You got a recording? A witness?" James didn't answer. They both knew the answer. Beckworth sighed. "Look, this is a civil matter. You need a lawyer, not a sheriff. Take it to court." "With what money?" James stood up. "We don't have money for lawyers. That's why my daddy borrowed in the first place." The sheriff's face softened slightly. "I'm sorry about your situation. I truly am. But Lucky Haynes pays his taxes, follows the law mostly, and has friends who'd make my life difficult if I started poking around without evidence. Best advice I can give you is to forget about the land and move on." James walked out of the sheriff's office at 11:23 a.m., stood in the parking lot under a sun that felt like it was trying to burn holes through his shirt. The temperature had climbed to 86 degrees, and the air tasted like hot asphalt and disappointment. The law wouldn't help. He'd known it before he walked in, but some part of him had needed to try, needed to prove to himself that he'd exhausted every legal option. Now he had. Tuesday morning, James drove to Vicksburg, 50 miles south, far enough that nobody would recognize him or ask questions. He found what he was looking for in a pawn shop on Washington Street, wedged between a bail bondsman and a closed diner. The shop smelled like gun oil and desperation, fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Behind the counter, a man in his 60s with tattooed forearms and suspicious eyes watched James browse the gun case. "Help you find something?" "Looking for a .45, James said. "Something reliable." The man pulled out a 1911, well used but maintained, Colt, Korean War surplus, $200. James held it, felt the weight, checked the action. It was solid, good enough for what he needed. "I'll take it." "And 2 boxes of ammunition. Need to see ID. Fill out the forms." James provided his driver's license, filled out the paperwork with steady hands, answered the questions. No, he wasn't a convicted felon. No, he hadn't been dishonorably discharged. Yes, he was purchasing for himself. All of it legal, all of it traceable. Some part of James's mind registered that he was creating a paper trail that would lead directly back to him. But he didn't care. This wasn't about getting away with something. This was about making things right. Total cost $247. He paid cash. Small bills from the envelope he kept hidden in his bedroom. Money he'd been saving for a new transmission for his truck. The pawn shop owner wrapped the pistol in brown paper, handed over the ammunition in a plastic bag. "Have a good day," the man said, already forgetting James's face. On Wednesday, James visited his father at Yazoo County Hospital. Samuel was still weak. Tubes running from his arms, oxygen mask making his words come out muffled and strange. His face had the gray papery quality of a man who'd used up most of his days. "Don't do nothing stupid, son," Samuel whispered, his hand gripping James's wrist with surprising strength. "The land ain't worth dying over. I'm not going to die, Daddy. That ain't what I'm worried about." Samuel's eyes were clear, seeing right through his son. "I know that look. Saw it on my own daddy's face once years ago. Man gets that look, people end up in the ground." James wanted to promise he'd let it go, walk away, be the bigger man. But he'd never lied to his father. Wasn't going to start now. Lucky Haynes stole from us, James said quietly. Robbed you in broad daylight with a smile on his face. And the law says that's fine. That's legal. That we should just take it and move on. But I can't do that. Some things you don't walk away from. Samuel closed his eyes. A tear ran down his weathered cheek. Then do what you got to do, the old man whispered. But Bobby, keep Bobby out of it. He's got a boy. Got a future. Bobby makes his own choices, Daddy. Samuel didn't respond. The machines beeped and hissed, counting down what little time he had left. That night, Wednesday, September 11th, James sat at his kitchen table with maps of Yazoo County spread out, marking locations with a pencil. Turner's warehouse on County Road 49. The route from there to Highway 49. The back roads that could serve as alternates. Distance from the nearest sheriff's substation, 18 miles. Response time if someone called it in, 20 minutes minimum. Bobby arrived at 8 p.m., parking his truck beside James's in the driveway. He came inside without knocking. Saw the maps, the gun wrapped in brown paper on the table, the boxes of ammunition stacked neatly beside it. This Saturday? Bobby asked. This Saturday. You sure about this? James looked up at his younger brother. Bobby was 29 years old, had a wife who loved him, and a son who needed him. He could still walk away. Should walk away. You don't have to be part of this, James said. I can do it alone. Bobby pulled out a chair, sat down across from his brother. You remember when I was 7 and those Harmon boys jumped me after school? Beat me so bad I couldn't see out of my left eye for a week. James remembered. He'd been 12, had found Bobby crying in a ditch by the road. You remember what you did? Bobby continued. I took care of it. You put both of them in the hospital. Dad had to pay their medical bills. You got suspended from school for 2 weeks. But you did it anyway because that's what brothers do. They don't let people hurt their family and walk away. Bobby stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the darkness. Sammy asked me yesterday if Grandpa Samuel was going to die. I told him no, that Grandpa was strong, that he'd be fine. But he ain't fine. He's dying because Lucky Haynes robbed him, and the stress broke his heart. And in a few years when Sammy's older and asks me what I did about it, I ain't going to tell him I stood by and did nothing. James felt something tight in his chest, loosened slightly. He'd been prepared to do this alone, had been ready to carry it all himself, but having Bobby beside him, it made the weight bearable. All right then, James said. We do this together. They spent the next 2 hours going over the plan. Who would be at the poker game? Lucky Haynes for sure, plus 7 or 8 regulars. Maybe Deputy Marcus Webb, who took Lucky's money to look the other way. The layout of Turner's warehouse. 1 main room, 1 back door, windows too high to climb through. The weapons. James's .45. Bobby's hunting rifle, a shotgun they'd borrow from their cousin Raymond, who wouldn't ask questions. At 11:47 p.m., Bobby drove home to his wife and son. James sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the maps, the gun, the choice he'd made. He thought about Sammy's small hands on his face, about his father in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive while his heart slowly gave up, about 3 generations of Carter men who'd worked that land, bled into that soil, believed that if you kept your word and worked hard, the world would treat you fair. Lucky Haynes had proven that belief was a lie. James could still stop, could throw the gun in the river, burn the maps, pretend he'd never planned any of this, could live the rest of his life knowing he'd been robbed and had done nothing, could watch his father die in shame, Could tell Sammy someday that when bad men do bad things, good men just accept it. No. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed. Some debts can only be paid in blood. At 1:30 a.m. On Thursday, September 12th, James finally went to bed. Lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle, crickets singing outside, the distant sound of a dog barking. He didn't sleep, just lay there, watching shadows move across the ceiling, knowing that in 2 days everything would be different. Friday evening, Bobby came by one last time. Not to plan, not to prepare, just to sit on the back porch with his brother, drinking Budweiser from cans that sweated in the humid air, watching the sun sink into the soybean fields like a copper coin dropping into dark water. They didn't talk about Saturday. Didn't talk about the warehouse or what they were going to do. Instead, they talked about when they were kids, before Vietnam, before wives and sons and dying fathers, when the world was simpler and summers lasted forever. Remember that time we tried to catch catfish with our bare hands in Bledsoe Creek? Bobby said, smiling, and you got bit by that snapping turtle? Still got the scar, James said, holding up his left hand, showing the white line across his thumb. Daddy laughed so hard, he nearly fell in the creek himself. They sat in comfortable silence after that, brothers who didn't need words to understand each other. The air smelled like turned earth and distant rain that would never come. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a whippoorwill called out, lonely and insistent. At 9:15 p.m., Bobby stood up. I should get home. Rita's making breakfast in the morning. Wants me to take Sammy to see Daddy at the hospital. That's good, James said. Daddy would like that. Bobby walked to his truck, paused with his hand on the door handle, turned back. James. After tomorrow, nothing's going to be the same. You all right with that? James took a long pull from his beer, looked out at the land that had belonged to his family for 55 years, and now belonged to a man who'd never worked a day in his life. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm all right with that. Bobby nodded, climbed into his truck, and drove away. His taillights disappeared down the dirt road, leaving James alone on the porch. At that moment, while James Carter sat in the darkness, making peace with what he was about to become, Lucky Haynes was at the Elks Lodge in Yazoo City, drinking bourbon and laughing about how he'd just acquired 180 acres of prime Delta farmland for $12,000. His friends raised their glasses. Someone told a joke. Lucky's yellow Cadillac gleamed in the parking lot outside, waxed and perfect, a monument to a man who believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that 24 hours from now, he'd be dead on the floor of Turner's warehouse, surrounded by 10 other men who'd made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Saturday morning, September 14th, 1974, dawned clear and hot, the sun rising over Yazoo County like it had done every morning since the beginning of time, indifferent to human plans, human anger, human justice. James woke at 5:15 a.m. Like always, made his coffee, sat on the porch, smoked his 2 cigarettes. Everything the same as every other morning, except for the pistol wrapped in brown paper on the kitchen table, and the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, he'd either be in jail or dead. At 8:47 p.m., on September 14th, 1974, James and Robert Carter climbed into James' pickup truck, a 1968 Ford F-100, dark green with a cracked windshield and 143,000 miles on the odometer, and drove toward County Road 49. In the truck bed, wrapped in canvas, a 4.5 pistol, a 12-gauge shotgun, a .30-06 hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to end 11 lives. What happened in the next 6 hours would transform two brothers from farmers into executioners, and a forgotten tobacco warehouse into a crime scene that FBI agents would study for decades, trying to understand how ordinary men become capable of extraordinary violence. 9:47 p.m. Saturday, September 14th, 1974. Temperature had dropped to 73 degrees, but the humidity made the air feel thick enough to choke on. The moon hung low and swollen in the eastern sky, nearly full, casting long shadows across County Road 49. Turner's warehouse sat 200 yards off the main road, a converted tobacco barn with rusted metal siding and a single bare bulb hanging over the entrance. Light leaked through cracks in the walls. Inside, men's voices carried on the night air. Laughter. The shuffle of cards. The clink of glass bottles. James Carter sat in his truck, engine ticking as it cooled, hands wrapped around the steering wheel. His mouth tasted like copper. His heart beat steady and slow the way it had in Vietnam when he'd waited for the order to move, that same cold clarity settling over him like a familiar coat. Bobby sat in the passenger seat, .3006 hunting rifle across his lap, staring at the warehouse. His hands trembled slightly. This was different from planning it, different from talking about it. This was real. Once they walked through that door, there was no coming back. "You ready?" James asked quietly. Bobby swallowed hard, nodded. Yeah, I'm ready. Remember, we lock the doors first. Nobody leaves. Nobody calls for help. I remember. James picked up the .45 from the bench seat, checked the chamber for the 10th time. 7 rounds. He had 2 spare magazines in his jacket pocket. Enough. More than enough. Bobby, after tonight, nothing's the same. You understand that? I understand. James looked at his younger brother, wanted to tell him to stay in the truck, to drive away, to save himself. But Bobby had made his choice. They'd made it together. Then let's finish this. They climbed out of the truck. The sound of crickets filled the night, so loud it seemed like the earth itself was screaming. James's boots crunched on gravel as he approached the warehouse. Through a gap in the siding, he could see them. 8 men gathered around a makeshift poker table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Lucky Haynes sat with his back to the door, wearing a tan suit jacket, even in this heat, gold rings catching the light. Deputy Marcus Webb sat to Lucky's right, still in uniform, his service revolver on the table beside his beer bottle. The other 6 were regulars, farmers, mechanics, men James had known for years. They were laughing. Someone had just won a hand. Money changed hands across the table. James reached the door. His hand touched the knob. Last moment. Last chance to turn back, drive home, forget this madness. He thought about his father in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive while his heart gave up. Thought about 3 generations of Carter land stolen with a smile and legal paperwork. No. James opened the door. The laughter died. 8 men looked up. Recognition dawned on their faces. First confusion, then understanding, then fear as they saw the pistol in James's hand and Bobby behind him with the rifle. "Nobody moves," James said. His voice was calm, dead calm. "Bobby, lock that back door." Bobby moved quickly, sliding the bolt on the rear exit. The metallic sound echoed in the sudden silence. Lucky Haynes stood up slowly, hands visible, that salesman's smile trying to appear. "James, Bobby, fellas, what's this about? We got a problem here?" "Sit down, Lucky." "Now let's talk about this," I said. "Sit down." Lucky sat. His smile was gone now. The other men around the table stayed frozen, understanding spreading like poison through their thoughts. Deputy Marcus Webb reached for his service revolver. James's .45 was faster. 9:51 p.m. The first shot echoed through the warehouse like thunder. Marcus Webb fell backward out of his chair, his hand never quite reaching his gun. His body hit the concrete floor with a sound like a sack of grain dropped from a truck bed. The other men erupted into motion. Vernon Tucker, 38, a soybean farmer from 3 miles north, lunged for the front door. Bobby's rifle barked once. Vernon stumbled, fell, didn't get back up. "Nobody else moves," James said louder now, the poor 5 tracking across the remaining 6 men. "You all just sit there and think about how you got here." Dale Morrison stood up anyway. 33 years old, married with 2 kids, farmed land adjacent to the old Carter property. He'd been at James's wedding in 1965. They'd helped each other with harvest for 15 years. "James, Jesus Christ, I can't what, Dale? Can't watch my family get destroyed while good Christian men look the other way? This is insane." No. Insane was thinking the law would help. Insane was believing men still had honor. This is just what happens when honor dies. Dale's eyes went to the locked back door, calculating distance. James saw the thought forming. "Don't," James said quietly. Dale ran anyway, made it 5 steps before Bobby's rifle spoke again. Dale Morrison dropped face first onto the concrete, one hand outstretched toward freedom he'd never reach. 3 down. 8 to go. James felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not the killing, but the absolute void where his conscience should be. He'd become a machine, processing problems, eliminating obstacles. The man who'd held his daughter when she cried, who'd helped neighbors birth calves, who'd believed in doing right. That man was gone. What remained was something colder, something necessary. Lucky Haynes sat very still now, hands flat on the table, all pretense of control abandoned. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool evening air. His tan suit jacket had dark patches under the arms. "The rest of you," James said, gesturing with the 4-5, "get up, move to that corner." The 5 remaining men, Lucky, plus Tommy Briggs, Ray Sutton, Carl Hendricks, and Wayne Palmer, shuffled toward the corner James indicated. They huddled together like cattle in a storm, looking at the bodies on the floor, at the locked doors, at the 2 Carter brothers who transformed into executioners. 10:03 p.m. James stood 10 feet away, 45 aimed at the group, while Bobby kept the rifle ready. The warehouse smelled like tobacco dust and gun smoke, and the copper tang of blood. The single bulb swayed slightly on its cord, casting moving shadows across walls that had seen 50 years of farming business and now witnessed its transformation into an abattoir. "You know why you're here," James said. His voice echoed in the space. "Every one of you sat at Lucky's table. Every one of you knew what he did to my family. Some of you helped him. The rest of you just looked the other way. James, please." Tommy Briggs spoke up. 41 years old, mechanic at the same garage where Bobby worked. They'd shared lunch breaks for 3 years. "I didn't have nothing to do with your daddy's land. I just came here to play cards. You were here when Lucky bragged about it 2 weeks ago. Saturday night, right at this table. You laughed. I heard about it." Tommy's face went white. "I didn't mean it was just what? Just funny? Just business? My father's dying, Tommy. That land was all he had left. And Lucky took it with paperwork and lies. And every man in this room knew about it and did nothing." Carl Hendricks, 52, stepped forward. Big man, worked construction, arms thick as fence posts. "You're right. What Lucky did was wrong. But killing us won't bring your land back, won't save your daddy. All it does is make you a murderer." James looked at Carl, remembered him helping pour the foundation for the new barn in '68, remembered sharing whiskey at Christmas parties, remembered thinking Carl was a good man. "You're right," James said quietly. "It won't bring anything back. But it'll make sure Lucky Haynes doesn't do this to another family. And it'll make sure every man who sat here and laughed at my father's suffering pays for that choice." We got families, Ray Sutton said. His voice cracked. Kids. Wives. You know that, James. You know us. I know my father had a family too. Didn't stop any of you. 10:14 p.m. While James Carter held 5 men at gunpoint in a warehouse on County Road 49, 3 miles away in the town of Silver City, Betty Thompson was closing up the Piggly Wiggly. She hummed along to the radio, Ain't No Sunshine by Bill Withers, and counted the register, making sure every penny balanced. In 12 hours, she'd open the store for Sunday morning customers and hear about the massacre. She'd cry for a week. But for now, she just hummed and counted, unaware that 11 families were being destroyed in the darkness beyond town. Lucky Haynes finally spoke. His voice had lost all its smooth confidence, reduced to something raw and desperate. James, listen to me. The land. I can give it back. I can tear up the deed transfer. Your daddy can have it all back. Just let us go. Please. James turned to face him. Lucky Haynes in his polyester suit, gold rings on every finger, hair slicked back with pomade that smelled like cheap chemicals. This was the man who'd smiled while robbing a dying man, who'd used legal paperwork like a weapon, who'd transformed trust into theft. You think this is negotiation, James said. You think there's a deal to be made? I can fix it. I swear I can make this right. You can't. It's too late. My father had a heart attack because of you. He's dying in a hospital bed right now, and the last thing he knows is that he lost everything. You can't fix that, Lucky. Can't undo that. Can't make him whole again. Lucky's face crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't think, no. You didn't think. You saw an old man who couldn't read legal documents and you saw a prophet. You're a predator, Lucky. Always have been. The only difference is that tonight you ran into something worse. Wayne Palmer, 26, youngest of the group, suddenly broke for the front door. Young legs, desperate speed, thinking maybe he could crash through the locked door before bullets found him. Bobby's rifle tracked him. The shot echoed. Wayne fell 3 feet from the door, close enough to touch the handle, far enough that it didn't matter. 4 down, 7 to go. The remaining 4 men in the corner, Lucky, Tommy, Ray, and Carl, stared at Wayne's body, understanding finally complete. There was no negotiation, no mercy, no way out. James, Carl Hendricks said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes, you're going to have to live with this every day for the rest of your life. You're going to see our faces, hear our voices. You'll never sleep right again. That's a heavy weight to carry. James met his eyes. I know. So why do it? Because some debts can only be paid in blood. Because the law won't protect decent people anymore. Because if I don't do this, men like Lucky will keep destroying families and getting away with it. That's not justice, Carl said quietly. That's revenge. I know the difference. Don't care anymore. 10:27 p.m., Bobby stood near the back door, rifle ready, watching his brother face down 4 terrified men. He thought about Sammy at home, sleeping in his bed with his toy truck on the nightstand. Thought about Rita waking up, wondering where he was. Thought about the man he'd been yesterday and the thing he was becoming tonight. James, Bobby said softly, we don't have to do all of them. Webb was armed. Lucky's the main one. The others, we could let them go. They ain't going to talk. James didn't turn around. They all made their choices, Bobby. They all knew. They're just gamblers. Just guys trying to make extra money. They laughed, Bobby. When Lucky bragged about taking our land, they laughed. You want to let that slide? Bobby didn't answer. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it ever had during deer season. Ray Sutton dropped to his knees. 43 years old, ran a feed store on Highway 49, Had 3 daughters and a wife who sang in the church choir. Please, he whispered, I got kids. 3 little girls. They need their daddy. I'll do anything. I'll sign over my store. I'll give you everything I have. Just don't. James walked toward him. Your daughters will cry. Your wife will grieve. They'll hurt for a long time. But they'll survive. They'll move on. Find a new normal. That's more than you gave my family. I didn't do nothing to your family. You did nothing. That's the problem. Evil wins when good men do nothing. You knew what Lucky was. You all knew, and you sat here every Saturday night, taking his money, enjoying his hospitality, while he destroyed people. Ray's face crumpled. Tears ran down his cheeks. I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. God's not here tonight, James said. Just us. 10:33 p.m. The shot echoed. Ray Sutton fell sideways, landing with his head on a burlap sack of fertilizer someone had left in the corner weeks ago. His eyes stayed open, staring at nothing. 5 down, 6 to go. Tommy Briggs tried to run then. Not toward the doors, he wasn't that stupid, but toward a stack of old tobacco crates, thinking maybe he could hide, maybe buy time, maybe somehow survive until dawn when someone might find them. Bobby's rifle tracked him almost lazily. The shot came before Tommy reached the crates. His body collapsed into them, sending the old wood clattering across concrete. 6 down, 5 to go. Carl Hendricks and Lucky Haynes stood side by side now, the last 2 beside Wayne Palmer's body near the door. Carl had stopped trying to negotiate, had accepted what was coming. He just stood there, big shoulders squared, looking at James with something that might have been pity. You were a good man once, James, Carl said quietly. I remember when you came back from Vietnam. You were different, but you were trying to be normal, trying to build something decent. What happened to that man? James felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the ice that had formed around his heart. The world ground him down, he said. Took everything he built, everything he believed in, banks, lawyers, men he thought were friends. The system crushed him until there was nothing left but this, so this is what's left. A killer. This is what's left when decent men have no other options. Carl nodded slowly. Then I'm sorry for you. Because you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cage, knowing you became the thing you hated most. I know. Was it worth it? James looked at Lucky Haynes, who was crying now. Mascara of fear running down his face. All that swagger and confidence melted away, leaving just a small man in a cheap suit who'd played with lives like they were poker chips. Ask me in 20 years, James said. 10:41 p.m. Carl Hendricks died standing up, facing it like he'd faced everything else in his life. Straight on. No flinching. His body fell with a heavy thump that seemed to shake the whole warehouse. 7 down, 4 to go. Lucky Haynes collapsed to his knees, all pretense gone. Reduced to what he'd always been under the suits and gold rings. A coward who preyed on weak people because he didn't have the courage to build anything real. Please, Lucky sobbed. Please, James. I'll do anything, anything. James stood over him. The .45 felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His hand didn't shake. That was the terrible thing. His hand was perfectly steady. You know what the worst part is, Lucky? It's not that you stole our land. It's not even that you destroyed my father. It's that you thought you'd get away with it. Thought you were untouchable. Thought men like me would just take it. I'm sorry, no, you're not. You're scared. That's different. Lucky looked up at him, tears cutting tracks through the sweat on his face. What do you want me to say? Nothing. There's nothing you can say that matters anymore. James stepped back, raised the pistol. Lucky closed his eyes. 10:44 p.m. The shot echoed through the warehouse, one final time. 8 down, 3 to go. But James was wrong. There were only supposed to be 8 men at the game tonight. The FBI would later discover that 3 more had shown up late. Jerry Coleman, 51, who'd driven in from Yazoo City. Patrick Walsh, 37, passing through on his way to Vicksburg. An 18-year-old Michael Dunn, Jerry's nephew, who'd come along to watch and learn how to play poker. They'd arrived at 10:30 p.m., seen James's truck parked outside, and decided to wait in Jerry's car until the game seemed less crowded. They'd fallen asleep, didn't hear the gunshots, didn't know what was happening inside. At 10:47 p.m., Jerry Coleman woke up and decided they'd waited long enough. He opened his car door just as James and Bobby walked out of the warehouse. Their eyes met across 30 feet of gravel parking area. Jerry saw the guns, saw the blood on James's hands, understood everything in an instant. "Run!" Jerry screamed. But there was nowhere to run. County Road 49 was empty. The nearest house was a mile away. The 3 men scrambled from the car, splitting up on pure instinct, hoping maybe one would survive to tell the story. Patrick Walsh ran toward the cotton fields, made it 15 yards before Bobby's rifle found him. He fell face first into turned earth that smelled like fertilizer and rain that would never come. Michael Dunn, 18 years old, ran toward the tree line. James chased him. The boy was fast, legs pumping, breath coming in terrified gasps. He might have made it, might have disappeared into the darkness and survived. But his foot caught on a root. He fell hard, scrambled to get up, looked over his shoulder, and saw James Carter standing there, .45 aimed at his chest. "Please," Michael whispered. "I'm just a kid. I don't even know what's going on." James saw his own son in that face, saw every boy who'd ever been young and scared and caught in something beyond his understanding. The ice around his heart cracked a little wider. "Wrong place," James said quietly. "Wrong time. I won't tell anyone. I swear. I didn't see nothing. I'm sorry, son." 10:49 p.m. The shot echoed across the cotton fields. Michael Dunn fell backward into the dirt, his eyes still wide with the shock of it, and lay still. 10 down, 1 to go. Jerry Coleman had run the other direction, toward the warehouse, thinking maybe he could lock himself inside, maybe find a phone, maybe something. But James caught him at the door. Jerry spun around, back against the metal siding. Nowhere left to run. "James, listen to me." Jerry's voice was steady despite the terror. "I know you. Known you for 15 years. You're not a killer. Whatever happened in there, it's not too late to stop. One survivor. That's all you need. Let me live and I'll tell them it wasn't murder. I'll tell them it was self-defense, that Lucky pulled a gun first. There were 8 men in there, Jerry. Nobody's going to believe one survived by accident, then make it look like I escaped. Like I hid. Give yourself a chance. I don't want a chance." Jerry stared at him. "What? This isn't about getting away with it. This is about making sure everyone knows what happens when you destroy a decent family. About sending a message that some men won't go quiet. That's insane. Maybe. But it's too late to be anything else." 10:52 p.m. Jerry Coleman fell, the last of 11 men who'd made the mistake of being connected to Lucky Haynes on the wrong Saturday night. James stood in the parking area, .45 hanging at his side, looking at the warehouse with its single light still burning inside. Looked at the bodies scattered across gravel and dirt, looked at his hands, steady and calm. A killer's hands. Bobby walked up beside him. "It's done." "Yeah, what now?" James looked at the eastern horizon where dawn would break in 7 hours. "Now we go home. We wait for them to come." They climbed into James's truck. Neither spoke. Bobby's rifle lay across his lap. James's pistol sat on the bench seat between them. The engine started with its familiar rumble. James drove away from Turner's warehouse, leaving 11 bodies in a crime scene that would make national news. As they turned onto Highway 49, heading back toward the Carter farm, James glanced in the rearview mirror. The warehouse light grew smaller in the distance, a single point of illumination in an ocean of darkness. He thought about his father in the hospital, dying without ever knowing his land had been avenged. Thought about Sammy, who'd grow up knowing his father and uncle were murderers. Thought about all the lives destroyed tonight, not just the 11 dead, but their families, their children, everyone connected to them. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than anything he'd carried in Vietnam, heavier than grief or anger or loss. This was the weight of becoming a monster. At 11:03 p.m., they arrived at the Carter farmhouse. The porch light was on, same as always. Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood. Everything looked normal. Everything was different. James set his pistol on the kitchen table. Bobby put the rifle beside it. They stood there in silence. Two brothers who'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "How long you think we got?" Bobby asked. "Dawn. Maybe. Somebody will find them by morning. FBI will be here by noon." Bobby nodded. Walked to the phone on the wall. "I should call Tell her." He stopped. What could he tell her? I don't know what to say. Tell her you love her. Tell her you're sorry. Tell her to explain to Sammy that his daddy tried to do right, even when right looked like wrong. Bobby picked up the phone. His hands shook now. Adrenaline finally wearing off. Reality crashing down. He dialed. Rita answered on the second ring. "Hey, baby," Bobby said, his voice breaking. "I need you to listen to me." James walked out onto the back porch, sat in his father's chair, lit a cigarette with hands that finally trembled. The night air smelled like turned earth and distant rain. Crickets sang their endless song. The world kept turning, indifferent to human tragedy, indifferent to the 11 families that would wake tomorrow to find their lives shattered. He thought about Samuel and his unborn grandchild. Thought about Margaret, who'd been a good wife for all these years. Thought about his father, who'd taught him that honor meant something, that a man's word was his bond, that you stood up for what was right. Samuel Carter had been right about all of it. The world just didn't care anymore. At 11:17 p.m., sitting on that porch under a moon that would witness his last hours of freedom, James Carter cried for the first time since Vietnam. Not for the men he'd ended, not even for himself, but for the version of James Carter who believed the world made sense, who thought honor mattered, who tried so hard to be decent in an indecent world. That man was dead, had died tonight in Turner's warehouse. What remained was just the husk waiting for consequences, carrying the weight of 11 lives ended and countless more destroyed. Inside, Bobby finished his phone call, came out to the porch, sat beside his brother. They didn't speak, just sat there as the night deepened, as the moon climbed higher, as the last hours of their old lives ticked away. At 6:47 a.m. On Sunday, September 15th, 1974, a passing truck driver saw bodies in the parking area of Turner's warehouse. He radioed for help. By 7:15 a.m., Yazoo County Sheriff Tom Beckworth stood in that warehouse, looking at 8 dead men and a crime scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By 8:30 a.m., the FBI had been notified. By 9:15 a.m., federal agents and state police surrounded the Carter farmhouse. James and Bobby Carter walked out with their hands raised. No resistance, no drama. Just two brothers who'd done what they believed had to be done, and now faced what came next. But the blood had been shed. The message had been sent, and for years afterward, In quiet conversations in Mississippi bars and around kitchen tables, people would talk about the night when Lucky Haynes's greed finally found its reckoning. When two brothers decided the law had failed and justice required blood. When 11 men paid the price for a system that had stopped protecting decent people. The Carter brothers would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Samuel Carter would die 3 weeks later, never knowing what his sons had done in his name. Rita would raise Sammy alone, telling him his father had been a good man pushed too far. And Turner's warehouse would stand empty for decades. A monument to the night when desperation and honor and violence collided in the Mississippi darkness. 6:47 a.m. Sunday, September 15th, 1974. Willie Jameson had been driving 18-wheelers across the South for 23 years. Hauled everything from cotton to cattle feed. Knew every back road between Memphis and New Orleans like he knew the lines on his own face. He was running behind schedule. A blown tire outside Jackson had cost him 2 hours, and he was taking County Road 49 as a shortcut to Highway 61. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the Delta sky in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful morning. Cool for September, maybe 68 degrees with a light breeze that carried the smell of turned earth and distant rain that might finally come. Willie had his window down, radio playing gospel music from a station out of Vicksburg, thinking about the ham and eggs waiting for him at the truck stop in Yazoo City. Then, he saw the bodies. At first, his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. 3 men lying in the gravel parking area of Turner's warehouse, not sleeping, not resting, dead. Even from the road, Willie could tell they were dead from the way they lay. Too still, too wrong, angles that living bodies don't make. He slowed his rig, pulled onto the shoulder, his hands suddenly shaking on the wheel. Should he stop? Should he keep driving? What if whoever did this was still there? But Willie Jameson was a decent man, had been raised in a Baptist church where they taught you that when you see someone in trouble, you help, even if they're beyond helping. He climbed down from his cab, legs feeling weak, and walked toward the warehouse. The gravel crunched under his boots, too loud in the morning silence. As he got closer, the smell hit him. Copper and waste, the particular stink of violent death that he'd smelled once before in Korea and had spent 23 years trying to forget. 3 bodies outside. Willie didn't touch them, didn't get close enough to see their faces. Just turned and saw the warehouse door hanging open. Looked inside. 8 more bodies. Willie Jameson, 51 years old, veteran father of 4, grandfather of 2, turned away and vomited into the dirt. Then he ran to his truck and grabbed his CB radio with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Willie on County Road 49. I need..." His voice broke. Started again. "I need police, sheriff, FBI. I don't know, there's... Jesus Christ, there's bodies everywhere. Turner's warehouse, 11, maybe more, all dead. Send everyone." At 7:02 a.m., the call came through to the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Sarah Mitchell took it, heard the panic in Willie's voice, and immediately radioed Sheriff Tom Beckworth at home. Beckworth was 56 years old, had been sheriff for 11 years, and had seen his share of Delta violence. Bar fights that turned fatal, domestic disputes that ended in tragedy. The occasional drug deal gone wrong, but when he pulled up to Turner's warehouse at 7:18 a.m. and saw Willie Jameson sitting on the running board of his truck, pale as death, rocking back and forth, Beckworth knew this was different. "How many?" Beckworth asked. Willie couldn't speak, just held up both hands, fingers spread. 11. Beckworth walked toward the warehouse. The morning sun was fully up now, bright and indifferent, illuminating the scene with cruel clarity. He'd known some of these men. Marcus Webb had worked for him until 6 months ago when he'd quit to work private security. Lucky Haynes was a known figure in the county, ran the poker games, had connections Beckworth had never quite been able to prove. Inside the warehouse, the smell was overwhelming, blood and gun smoke, and the beginning stages of decay in the humid delta heat. 8 bodies scattered across the concrete floor, shell casings everywhere, the poker table overturned, money scattered like autumn leaves. Beckworth had been a Marine in Vietnam, had seen combat, had seen what men could do to each other when civilization's thin veneer cracked. But this was methodical. This was execution. He stepped carefully through the scene, radio in hand, calling it in. "This is Sheriff Beckworth. I need FBI at Turner's warehouse on County Road 49. Multiple homicides, 11 confirmed. Scene is," he paused, looking at the carnage. "Scene is extensive, appears to be targeted. Send everyone." While Beckworth walked through that warehouse, documenting death with a voice that stayed professional through sheer force of will, 3 miles away in Silver City, Rita Carter was making breakfast for Sammy. Scrambled eggs and toast, orange juice in his favorite cup with the cartoon characters. Normal Sunday morning. She'd heard Bobby come home late, heard him and James talking in low voices on the porch, but hadn't asked questions. Her husband came and went. That was farm life. Sammy ate his eggs and asked when they could go see Grandpa Samuel at the hospital. Rita said maybe this afternoon after church. The radio played country music from a Jackson station. Dolly Parton singing about Jolene. The coffee smelled good. Sunday morning light came through the kitchen window, warm and safe. Nobody knew yet that 11 families had been destroyed, that Bobby Carter would never come home again, that Sammy would grow up visiting his father in prison, trying to understand why Daddy had done what he'd done. For now, Rita just hummed along with Dolly and wiped egg from Sammy's face. Normal. Everything normal for a few more hours. By 9:30 a.m., FBI Special Agent Harold Briggs arrived from Jackson. 52 years old, 26 years with the Bureau, had worked everything from bank robberies to civil rights murders. He'd seen the 1964 killings, had helped investigate the Klan violence that had turned Mississippi into a war zone, thought he'd seen the worst of what humans could do. But this was different. This wasn't ideological violence. This was personal. Calculated. 11 men eliminated with military precision in one night. Briggs walked the scene with Beckworth, studied the angles, counted shell casings, reconstructed the timeline. 2 shooters minimum, Briggs said, kneeling beside a 4.5 casing, probably 3. Multiple weapons. They came prepared. This wasn't rage. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was planned. "I know who did it," Beckworth said quietly. Briggs looked up. "How?" "Because I saw it coming. Just didn't think it would go this far." Beckworth pulled out a folder from his patrol car. "A man named James Carter came to see me Monday morning. Said Lucky Haynes had defrauded his father. Wanted me to investigate. I told him it was a civil matter. Needed a lawyer. And 5 days later, Lucky Haynes is dead on the floor with 10 other men." Briggs took the folder. Read through it. The loan documents. The deed transfer. The legal paperwork that had robbed Samuel Carter of everything his family had built for 3 generations. "So this was revenge," Briggs said. "This was justice," Beckworth corrected, then stopped himself. "No, that's wrong. This was revenge. But I understand why he thought it was justice." Over the next 3 days, the investigation expanded. Briggs brought in a full forensics team from Jackson. They processed the warehouse, documented everything, collected evidence with mechanical precision. The ballistics came back Wednesday morning. 3 weapons, a .45 caliber pistol, a .3006 hunting rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun. The .45 and the .3006 were registered to James Lee Carter. The shotgun was untraceable, probably borrowed or bought secondhand. The timeline was reconstructed through careful analysis. 9:47 p.m. the Carter brothers arrived. 9:51 p.m. first shots fired. The massacre lasted approximately 2 hours. By midnight, all 11 men were dead. The Carter brothers drove away at approximately 12:15 a.m. But it was Wednesday afternoon when Deputy Sarah Mitchell found something in the county records that changed everything. She'd been going through Lucky Haynes's business dealings, looking for connections, when she found the loan file. Samuel Carter, hospitalized September 6th with a heart attack. Admitted at 2:47 p.m., right after discovering his land had been stolen through legal fraud. Mitchell brought it to Briggs and Beckworth. They read through the documents in silence. The predatory loan, the deliberately confusing terms, the automatic transfer of the deed when Samuel couldn't make impossible payments. All of it legal. All of it theft dressed up in lawyer language. Christ, Briggs said finally. 11 people died over this. Not over land, Beckworth said. Over honor. Over a father's humiliation, over a system that protects predators and grinds down decent people until they break. That doesn't justify mass murder. Tom, I know, but it explains it. By Thursday morning, the story had spread through Yazoo County like wildfire. 11 dead. The Carter brothers responsible. Everyone had an opinion. At the Silver City Cafe, a small diner on Highway 49 that served as the town's informal gathering place, conversations grew heated. Martha Webb, Marcus's widow, sat in a corner booth with her sister, crying into a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her husband was dead. Killed for taking Lucky Haynes's money to look the other way at a poker game. But at the counter, old Henry Pritchard, who'd farmed the Delta for 63 years, said what others were thinking but afraid to voice. Lucky Haynes was a thief. Always has been. We all knew it. And we all let him operate because it was easier than standing up. Maybe if we'd done something about him years ago, this wouldn't have happened. You saying those 11 men deserve to die? Martha Webb's sister challenged. I'm saying when you create a system where decent people have no legal recourse, where predators can destroy families with paperwork and a smile, eventually someone's going to say enough. The Carter boys just said it louder than most. The town split. Not cleanly, not neatly, but split nonetheless. Pastor Eddie Hinton at First Baptist struggled through Sunday service 1 week after the massacre. We ask why, he said from the pulpit, his voice breaking. Why this violence? Why couldn't neighbors help neighbors? Why couldn't the law protect the innocent? Why did 11 men have to die? He paused, looking at his congregation. Half the size it had been last week. Families of the dead refusing to sit in the same building as families who quietly sympathized with the Carters. I don't have answers, just grief, and the knowledge that we all failed. All of us. We knew Lucky Haynes was corrupt. We knew the Carters were suffering. We knew, and we did nothing. Now 11 families will never be whole again. The investigation revealed more. Vernon Tucker had helped Lucky write the predatory loan terms. Dale Morrison had witnessed Samuel Carter's signature and knew the old man couldn't read legal documents. Deputy Marcus Webb had been taking monthly payments to ensure the poker games ran without interference. Not all the victims were innocent. Not all deserved what happened. But none deserved execution. On Thursday afternoon, September 19th, 1974, 4 days after the massacre, FBI Special Agent Harold Briggs and Sheriff Tom Beckworth drove out to the Carter farmhouse. They had arrest warrants for James Lee Carter and Robert Franklin Carter, two brothers who decided the law had failed and justice required blood. They approached with caution. 8 officers, 3 vehicles, rifles ready, expecting maybe a standoff, maybe a final shootout, maybe suicide by cop. What they found was James Carter sitting on his back porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the soybean fields. Bobby sat beside him, both unarmed, both calm, both waiting. James stood slowly as Beckworth approached. "Sheriff, I expect you're here about Saturday night. James, I need you and Bobby to come with us." "I know." James set his coffee cup down carefully. "We're not going to make this difficult. We did what we had to do. Now we face what comes next." Bobby stood beside his brother. Younger, less certain, but resolved. "Sheriff, I got a wife and a son. Can I call them? Say goodbye?" Beckworth nodded. "Make it quick." Bobby went inside. They heard him on the phone, voice breaking as he told Rita he loved her. Told her to explain to Sammy that his daddy had tried to protect Grandpa Samuel, that sometimes good men do bad things for good reasons. Tell him that his daddy loved him more than anything in the world. When Bobby came back out, his eyes were red. He held up his hands for the cuffs. Beckworth put the handcuffs on James Carter personally. As he clicked them closed, he couldn't help himself. "Was it worth it, James?" James looked at his land, the farmhouse his grandfather built, the fields 3 generations of Carters had worked, the life he was about to lose forever. "You ever been pushed to the edge, Tom, where everything you believe in gets stripped away and the system you trusted spits you out like you're nothing?" That's not an answer. No, but it's the truth. James paused. "Lucky Haynes destroyed my father, stole everything we built. And the law said that was fine, that was legal, that we should just accept it. So I made my own law. 11 men, James, 11 families destroyed. I know, I'll carry that weight the rest of my life. But Lucky Haynes won't destroy another family. That debt's been paid." They led him to the patrol car. Bobby followed quietly. Both brothers climbed into the back seat without resistance, without drama. Just 2 men who'd crossed a line and now faced the consequences with the same grim determination they'd shown when planning the massacre. As they drove away, James Carter looked out the window at his family's land one last time. Samuel Carter was in the hospital dying, unaware that his sons had avenged him. Rita was home with Sammy, about to discover that her husband was gone forever, and the Delta stretched out endless and indifferent, continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of human tragedy. At 4:47 p.m. on September 19th, 1974, James and Robert Carter were booked into Yazoo County Jail on 11 counts of first-degree murder. They would be held without bail. The trial would make national news. And the question that haunted everyone, law enforcement, journalists, the divided community, was simple and terrible. Had the Carter brothers done the right thing? Were they desperate men protecting their family's honor, or were they mass murderers who dressed up their crimes in the language of justice? And where exactly was the line between revenge and righteousness, between breakdown and standing up, between victim and villain? The law would eventually answer those questions with a verdict. But Yazoo County would debate them for decades, divided forever by one Saturday night when 2 brothers decided that some debts could only be paid in blood, and 11 men paid the price for a system that had stopped protecting the decent and the desperate. The trial of James Lee Carter and Robert Franklin Carter began on March 18, 1975, 6 months after the massacre, in a Jackson courtroom 200 miles from Yazoo County. Venue had been changed. No possibility of finding an impartial jury in a county where everyone had known someone connected to the case, where every conversation at the cafe or the gas station or the church still circled back to that Saturday night. 11 counts of first-degree murder each, 22 combined capital charges. The prosecution had confessions. Both brothers had admitted everything to FBI agents the day of their arrest. Had forensic evidence. Shell casings. Ballistics. Fingerprints. Had timeline reconstruction so detailed it left no room for reasonable doubt. Had motive documented in legal papers and hospital records. The defense, two court-appointed attorneys from Jackson, who looked overwhelmed from opening statements, attempted to argue temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional distress. They painted a picture of a dying father, a stolen legacy, a predatory criminal system that destroyed decent families while the law looked away. They called character witnesses who testified that James Carter had been a good man, a war hero, someone who'd never shown violent tendencies outside combat. The prosecution demolished that argument in under 2 hours. Temporary insanity doesn't involve 5 days of planning, doesn't involve driving to Vicksburg to buy a gun, doesn't involve mapping escape routes, doesn't involve a calculated decision to eliminate every witness in that warehouse. This wasn't madness brought on by unbearable stress. This was premeditated mass murder dressed up in the language of honor and justice. The jury, 12 people from Jackson who understood Delta life but hadn't lived the specific pressures of Yazoo County, deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. On March 27, 1975, they returned their verdict. Guilty. All charges. Both defendants. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. James Lee Carter, death penalty. Robert Franklin Carter, death penalty. When the judge read the sentences, James showed no emotion, no tears, no shock, no protest. Just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he'd pulled that trigger on Deputy Marcus Webb that this was exactly where the path led. Bobby cried. Not for himself, but thinking about Sammy growing up without a father. About Rita raising their son alone. About all the normal life that would never be. The death sentences were automatically appealed. In 1978, they were commuted to life without possibility of parole when the Supreme Court ruled on procedural issues in Mississippi death penalty cases. James and Bobby Carter would spend the rest of their lives in prison. No parole hearings. No hope of freedom. Just decades stretching ahead in concrete cells, carrying the weight of 11 dead. James Carter served 29 years at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. During that time, he worked in the prison carpentry shop, taught other inmates woodworking, kept to himself, never caused trouble. Guards said he was the quietest inmate they'd ever known. Never complained. Never fought. Just existed in that space between life and death that long-term prisoners inhabit. Rita visited Bobby every month for 18 years, bringing Sammy until the boy turned 16 and refused to go anymore. She never remarried, never moved away from Yazoo County, just worked her shifts at the Piggly Wiggly, raised her son, visited her husband, and carried a grief so deep it became part of her bone structure. On November 3, 2003, at age 63, James Lee Carter died of a massive heart attack in the prison infirmary at 4:22 a.m. The chaplain on duty reported that James's last coherent words were asking about his father, whether Samuel had ever known what they'd done in his name. The chaplain couldn't answer. Samuel Carter had died on October 4, 1974, 3 weeks after the massacre, never knowing his sons had avenged him. Never knowing the price of that revenge. James was buried in the prison cemetery with a simple marker, James L. Carter, 1940, 2003. No mention of father, son, veteran, farmer. Just dates marking the beginning and end of a life that had transformed from honest work to unthinkable violence. Robert Franklin Carter remains incarcerated at Parchman as of 2024. He's 79 years old now. Sammy visits twice a year, dutiful but distant, maintaining connection to a father he barely remembers outside prison walls. In a 2019 interview for a documentary about the case, Bobby said only, "I followed my brother. That's what I always did. Would I do it different if I could go back? I ask myself that every day. Still don't have an answer. Rita Carter died in 2018 at age 74. Cancer. Bobby wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. Sammy is 53 now, works as an electrician in Memphis, married with 2 daughters who know their grandfather is in prison, but not why. The family name carries weight. Not pride, just history that can't be escaped. Samuel Carter's 180 acres of land reverted to distant relatives after legal battles that lasted until 1982. They sold it immediately to an agricultural corporation. Today, it's part of a 2,400-acre industrial soybean operation managed by people who never knew the Carter family, who don't know that 3 generations of farmers bled into that soil before losing it to a man in a cheap suit with predatory loan documents. The victim's family scattered like leaves after a storm. Sharon Haynes, Lucky's widow, moved to Memphis in 1975 with their 2 teenage daughters. She remarried in 1980, lived quietly until her death in 2009. Her daughters changed their last names, moved to different states, built lives disconnected from their father's legacy. Marcus Webb's widow, Martha, stayed in Yazoo County, raised their 3 children alone. Never spoke publicly about the massacre. She died in 2016 at age 78. One of her sons became a police officer, maybe trying to redeem his father's corruption, maybe just following what he knew. Vernon Tucker's family, his wife Emma and 2 young sons, left Mississippi entirely, moved to Oregon, started over where nobody knew their history. Dale Morrison's widow Carol remarried within 2 years, desperate to rebuild normalcy for her children. Some called it disrespectful. She called it survival. The warehouse on County Road 49 stood empty for decades. Nobody would rent it. Nobody would buy it. Too much history. Too many ghosts. It finally burned down in 1998. Arson. Investigators suspected but never proved. Today, it's just an empty lot where weeds grow and local teenagers sometimes park to drink beer, completely unaware that 11 men died there in one night of blood and reckoning. Yazoo County changed after September 14, 1974. For a while, neighbors helped each other more openly. Debts were forgiven faster. Disputes were settled before they could fester. The local banks became marginally more lenient. Nobody wanted to be the institution that drove another family to violence. But change isn't permanent when it's born from fear rather than understanding. Within a decade, new people had moved in who didn't remember. The foreclosures resumed. The economic pressures returned. Human nature being what it is, the lessons faded like morning fog burning off Delta fields. FBI Special Agent Harold Briggs retired in 1994 after 36 years of service. In a 2015 interview for the 50th anniversary of the massacre, he said, legally, the Carter brothers were mass murderers who deserved their sentences. Morally, they were desperate men pushed past all reasonable limits by a system that had completely failed them. I've investigated over 200 homicides in my career. The Carter case is the only one where I still don't know if justice was served. The law says yes. My conscience says I don't know. Sheriff Tom Beckworth never ran for re-election after 1976. He said the job had changed. Or maybe he had. He died in 1988 at age 69. His son told a reporter that his father had nightmares about Turner's warehouse for the rest of his life, would wake up seeing those 11 bodies, smelling gun smoke and blood, wondering if he could have prevented it all by just investigating Lucky Haynes when James Carter had asked him to. The story has no heroes. It has a father who loved his family more than his own life, and 11 men who'd made choices, some corrupt, some thoughtless, some simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, that set a tragedy in motion. It has a system that failed at every level. Predatory lending practices that destroyed families, law enforcement that couldn't help or wouldn't help, neighbors who turned away when help was needed, and a code of honor so rigid it made violence seem like the only option remaining. Were the Carter brothers murderers? Yes. They eliminated 11 people with premeditation and planning. Some who were sleeping, some who begged for mercy. Without trial, without legal authority, without hesitation. Were they desperate men driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously, and that's the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do in their place? How far would we go to protect our family's honor? Does justice exist when the system has completely failed? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence, or does extreme pressure erase that line entirely? When society's structures break down, when law becomes a weapon rather than a shield, when predators use legal paperwork to destroy lives, what are decent people supposed to do? The Carter brothers crossed a boundary no human being should cross, but that boundary existed in a world where authorities couldn't protect, where criminals operated legally, where a dying father's humiliation went unpunished, where an honest farmer facing ruin had nowhere to turn except to violence. There's no easy answer. No clear moral. No satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create their own monsters, and sometimes the line between justice and revenge becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides. 50 years have passed since that September night in the Mississippi Delta. Rural America hasn't healed. It's evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems fail them. Every year, some choose violence. Every year, someone somewhere decides that legal channels have failed, that honor demands blood, that protecting family requires becoming what you fear most. The Carter family farmhouse still stands today, though it's been sold 3 times since 1974. Current owners are from California, bought it in 2019, know nothing of its history. Their children play in the yard where James Carter sat that last Friday night, drinking beer with his brother, making peace with the choice they'd already made. Turner's warehouse site is an empty lot now. No memorial. No plaque. No historical marker explaining that this was where 11 men died because 2 brothers decided the law had failed and justice required blood. The Delta just moved on the way it always does, covering scars with layers of cotton and soybeans and normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. Revenge doesn't bring back what's lost. It doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't restore stolen land or dying fathers. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new families, learning to live with grief that never quite fades. James Carter saved his family's honor but lost his soul. He eliminated a predator but created 11 shattered families. He won a battle against injustice but lost the war against his own humanity. He spent 29 years in a cell thinking about 11 faces, 11 families, 11 futures erased in 2 hours of calculated violence. Was it worth it? That's the question James Carter died with. That's the question Bobby Carter lives with every day in his cell at Parchman. That's the question we're left with. Each of us examining our own moral boundaries, wondering how far we'd go, how much we'd sacrifice, what we'd become if pushed to the edge, where desperation and honor and violence all blur together. If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for protecting those we love, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far ordinary people will go when pushed past all reasonable limits. Comment below. What would you have done in James Carter's position? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance when the system fails completely? What are decent people supposed to do? Because these stories aren't just from the past. They're happening right now somewhere in forgotten corners where systems fail and desperation takes hold. The names change, the details shift, but the fundamental question remains. What happens when ordinary men are pushed too far? When does the victim become the villain? When does protection become murder? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One predatory loan, one corrupt official, one refused handshake, one desperate decision at a time. The line between hero and villain, between justice and revenge, between protecting family and destroying lives, that line is thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, it disappears entirely.